Well, hello and welcome to Insight with political tours and beyond the headlines. According to official figures, some 390,000 people in India have died from COVID-19. But many put that figure way higher, possibly 2 million, according to The Economist, making it far the worst crisis to hit the country since its creation and the worst COVID-19 death toll in the world. None of this is good news for Narendra Modi, India's Prime Minister, who for years has been sailing high in the opinion polls. Has he lost his touch, or is this just bad luck? And where does he go now? We're joined by the BBC's Rahul Tandon. Rahul spends his time between here and India, and he's currently here. Hello and welcome, Rahul.
Hello, indeed. Yeah, glad to be in the UK. I'm missing India, and as always, a very interesting period in Indian history, as you aptly summed it up there.
Rahul, can you just give us a sort of an overview of what has been happening in the last few months, and maybe just take us back possibly to January before the second wave hit, where I think India thought that it got away with the worst of things?
It certainly did. Talking to people in India, I think there was I would get calls. Let's give you an anecdote to start with. I would get calls from my friends and family in India saying, "What are you doing in the UK? Come to India. Look at us. We've conquered COVID," a word that the Indian Prime Minister also used when he was at Davos. And so India had gone back to normal. The first wave had been very difficult in terms of movement of population. We'd seen many migrant workers flee from the cities in what was seen as the biggest movement that the country had seen since partition. And I remember speaking to one family who sent me the dying conversation of their father as he tried to walk almost 500 kilometers from where he was working back to his village in Uttar Pradesh. And I think that was the moment where we began to see the first criticism of the Indian Prime Minister, because he did bring in a lockdown, but he brought it in overnight, which in India, where you have millions and millions of migrant workers ending up being stranded in cities, was, I think, the first time that we began to hear criticism of a figure that has dominated Indian politics for the last 12 or 13 years. We then move and we see travel between the UK and India not being stopped by both countries. And we saw then the development of the Kent variant coming into the north of India, particularly the states of Punjab and Delhi, where we have a lot of movement of people between them. After that, we saw the development of the Delta variant, as it's now known, or the Indian variant. In that period, the government seemed to be very slow to move. And I think what the policy we'd seen from the central government was that they felt politically the best thing to do was to allow state governments to deal with this. But that caused a lot of problems. Negotiations of vaccines became a huge issue. Supplies of oxygen, which I think people will have seen graphically on their scenes. And as we continue to have a movement of population in India, and anybody who's been to India will know it's almost impossible to self-isolate anyway when you look at the number of people, more than 1.3 billion, that we're talking about. And so it began in Mumbai and Delhi, where we began to see these cases rising exponentially. We saw a healthcare system completely collapse. And that's a very important thing, not only because of the toll that we saw, the death toll because of it, and I think many would agree with the estimate of figures that you gave at the beginning, but more importantly, what we've seen over the last decade in India is a growing nationalist feeling, a growing feeling of a country that is significant on the world stage, and a growing feeling that India's own facilities were now moving to levels that I wouldn't say were close to the UK or the US or Australia, but we're certainly moving in that direction. And I think when people began to see that they couldn't get oxygen in hospitals, that there were not enough doctors and nurses to deal with it, as there have been in many parts of the world, but clearly not even close. That was where we began to see many middle-class Indians for the first time beginning to question whether the country had moved as far forward as they had thought it had moved forward. We're now seeing those cases.
These are the people who are really his voters, so middle-class Indians, really have backed Modi
the bedrock.
in a way.
Yeah, the bedrock of the Modi government, because I'm sure we'll come on to Hindutva and the role that religion plays in the world's largest democracy. But remember when Narendra Modi won the government, and I traveled the length and breadth of India, going from village to talk to people there, and saw some of the famous Modi holograms, went to some of his rallies. It was development that Narendra Modi promised the people of India. And what he promised them was something in tune with the young country, was he would meet their aspirations and the aspirations of people arising in India every day. Go to a village in India, Nick, and speak to a farmer's son. And what the one thing he'll tell you is, I don't want to be a farmer anymore.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. So, and what I was looking just through, looking at this is looking at economic policy, but one of the things that struck me was that expenditure on healthcare had fallen to one of the lowest rates in the world. I mean, it's just hovering over 2%.
Yeah.
Which, a fraction of.
Yeah, historically. I mean, for all India's success stories, just pick up Amartya Sen's book and compare India to Bangladesh on child mortality, outside toilets. I mean, just a number of indicators. People would be very surprised to see that India has not moved as quickly as people would have hoped. It would be unfair to place the full blame of that on the Modi government, because we've had successive governments, particularly the Congress party, since independence, and there has been a shocking lack of investment in the Indian healthcare system. Go and speak to any doctor, and they'll tell you the conditions that are there in urban India. Rural India, well, try and get close to a hospital if you live into a village. It's virtually impossible. And going back to that middle class, which is the bedrock of Narendra Modi, a middle-class Indian will not go to a government hospital. They'll be in a private hospital because they know at least there they may get some sort of healthcare treatment.
Yeah. Let's go back a step and just remind us how Modi came to power, how he came to office. I want to talk in a bit about, Hindu nationalism, and but also I really do want to talk about the idea of economic competency, the idea that he was going to reform the economy, boost growth, and also, get people out of farms and into jobs. But before we get into all of that, just give us a bit of a background about him, how he started off, as a small stall trader, as a very poor person. You wouldn't expect him to have got into politics.
No, not at all. He was a chaiwala, as he's known in India, somebody who would serve tea on the stations, the platforms. If anyone's traveled in India, you'll have seen them there. Those young boys who are running around and doing that. But he was somebody who'd always had an interest at a young age in politics. And he comes from the West Indian state of Gujarat, which has produced a number of Indian leaders, notably Mahatma Gandhi and Sardar Patel, two of the three key figures in the independence of India. So he comes from an area that's pretty politicized. And right from that early age, even when he was a chaiwala, he was getting involved with the RSS. Now, the RSS are basically the organized part of the Bharatiya Janata Party, which has become the dominant force in Indian politics. And I think a very crucial phase in the rise of Narendra Modi, and that's something we'll talk about a lot, but the rise of the BJP coincides with the Ayodhya temple dispute in India. The Muslim temple that Hindus claim was on the birthplace of Lord Ram in this small, pretty indescript village in India's most populous state, in Uttar Pradesh. And whilst one of the key figures in that was another figure from Gujarat called L.K. Advani, who became India's home minister, a man who had aspirations to be prime minister but never made it. And he led the Ayodhya movement in the 80s. And he would go on what was called a Rath Yatra, a chariot. And the driver of that chariot was Narendra Modi. And that propelled him up the ranks very quickly of the BJP. And he was soon one of their official spokespersons. I remember he was constantly coming in and out of the Delhi office, particularly on Hindi radio, because, at that stage, his English was not as fluent as it is nowadays. And he then became the chief minister of Gujarat, India's most powerful economic state, in the early 2000s, and was then seen as somebody who his followers would say rapidly developed that, and that became then the most prosperous state in India, an example to other states. Others would say the Gujaratis have always been the most economically prosperous community in India. Go to any part of the world, wherever you're listening to it at the moment, you will find a Gujarati businessman or businesswoman probably operating near you. At that point, we had this older leadership of the BJP. Atal Bihari Vajpayee was the prime minister, and L.K. Advani was the home minister, these two dominant figures. But over the years, as the BJP got out of power, they began to lose their influence in the party. They were seen as too old, and they needed a new, young, dynamic figure to come in with new ideas. And Narendra Modi, as the most prosperous, most prominent member of the party in terms of state leaders, emerged therefore as the leader of the BJP. Of course, there were the Gujarat Riots, which I covered in 2002, where we saw many Muslims killed after an attack on Hindu pilgrimages at Godhra. And many people said then, still say today, that Narendra Modi turned a blind eye to those riots that took place in Gujarat that saw the death of thousands of Muslims and should never have become the Indian prime minister. But he emerged as the dominant figure for the BJP. He's now won 2 successive elections. And even though today his popularity is certainly not what it was 12 months ago, I think you'd find very few Indians still, after what's happened, betting against Narendra Modi, not somehow being able to pull off another remarkable election victory. Because remember, this is a man who has not just changed Indian politics, but changed the way campaigning is undertaken in India. He's shifted it to an almost presidential style of elections. Whether you're a fan of Narendra Modi or not, and he divides opinions like many of those world leaders have done over the last few years, one thing that you have to say is this is a man who has, whether you think it's good or bad, changed India forever.
Okay, let's talk in a bit more detail. There's a sort of dual platform here. There's Hindu nationalism and there's economic reform, and the two are intertwined. But if we can try and separate them out, let's talk about the economic reform side of things. There have been some very controversial policies introduced. There was the currency reform. There's the what we'd call VAT in the UK.
GST, yeah.
A sales tax, which was introduced. Can you just talk me through both those just to start with?
Well, these were the 2 key moments in the first term of the Indian prime minister. Demonetization was, I mean, I was in India when it happened. It was the most stunning decision ever, where you, in a country of, more than 1.3 billion people, say, basically, we're ending the currency and we're going to reprint new notes. And there are 2 reasons for this, because we think there's a lot of fake currency in the system. And also we want to move away from a cash economy. We want people
the reform was taking 2 key notes out of circulation.
Yeah. The 1,000 rupee note and the 500 rupee note.
500 rupee, yeah.
Which are basically, which basically were the major notes in circulation. It was announced. And I mean, this is the thing with Modi, which has made him very popular in some ways, is when he makes a decision, he doesn't waste any time. He comes in instantly. And this is what happened. I remember we all watched it on television. Obviously, we all jumped into action as journalists, but just the people around us, everybody was stunned. Nobody knew what they were going to do. People started rushing to banks. Cash machines suddenly ran out of money very quickly. There were many people who thought he would lose huge amounts of support for that, because the people who suffered the most were the poor, because many of them in rural India.
What was the purpose of it? What was the thought behind it?
Well, the thoughts were 2. Number one was the amount of fake currency that was in the system that they wanted to move. Number 2, according to the government, was they wanted to clamp down on the black economy, which exists in India, because India's always had this fundamental problem. The black economy, which some would say is almost 40% of India's national economy, means that people are not paying tax and the government's struggling to get money to invest in healthcare, etc. Critics said this was a way for him to basically clamp down on his political opponents before important elections in India's most populous state, Uttar Pradesh, that basically this would because Indian politics is a cash-based operation, this would decimate their finances. So that was another reason that was put forward, that the Modi government they knew this was coming. So They were able to prepare for it, but his political opponents basically lost all their cash.
Yeah. And at that point, I mean, I think it was to try and enable make people pay more taxes. I mean, what percentage of the population are estimated to pay income tax?
2. it's about the figures in India are about 2%, because if you look at the salaried class in India is much higher, but the majority of India work in that most of Indians work in that informal sector still. And so they've been trying to boost up that tax rate, which then brought them on to their next idea, which was a general sales tax in India, the GST, as you said, an equivalent of VAT. Also, you had this bizarre situation in India that when you move your products from one state to another because of different taxation systems, that made the whole process very complicated. This had been a reform that every single political party in India had been calling for decades. It was one of the pivotal policies of the Modi government that he was going to introduce something that the Congress government actually proposed before, but it never
simplify the system to make it
simplify the system. Again, though, the criticism was that there was no leeway put in place. I'll give you an example. I was at a market in Mumbai, talking to shopkeepers there who were very happy with GST, and they said, we want to have a system like this that is put in place. But there were a number of problems. Firstly, the coding of different products made it extremely complicated. Secondly, India is a country where people are still struggling with the internet. And so you're asking people to file online their GST returns. We're in one of Mumbai's best markets. The internet just doesn't even work in there. So, shopkeepers were saying, we don't have access to the internet. How are we supposed to file these returns? We should have had time to be able to have them put in place. And secondly, we're shopkeepers. We're not accountants. We don't know how to do this. So even though it was a policy that was seen favorably by most people, its implementation, again, caused a lot of debate in India.
Okay, those are the two sort of big economic reforms. But what about his overall promise on economic growth? There's infrastructure spending, but he also said that manufacturing would be increased and that there would be substantial boosts in exports, and you'd see Indian GDP grow to, I think, something like I can't remember the something like $5 trillion was the target. I think less than half of that.
And they're not close to it. Yeah. They're not close to it. Modi's economic reforms, I think people who really wanted him to push through reforms are disappointed. In that he's not pushed further, particularly on land reforms, because that's a very crucial part of India where, there's just not enough space at the moment in the cities. So India somehow has to create new cities in agricultural areas, but he's not been able to get that through. I think the scale of the problem that he faces economically, we can see with the farmers' reforms. For post-independence, it has been quite clear that India needs to reform its farming sectors. Basically, almost 50% of Indians are involved in the agricultural sector. And it's too many people. India needs less farmers. We've had the liberalization of the economy under the Congress government in the late 1980s with Manmohan Singh, who then became prime minister, driving that forward. And that has radically changed India. Whether India has grown as quickly as it should have done, but it is an emerging economic superpower. You just have to go to the country, go on one of your tours, walk around India now. You will see huge wealth generation that's taken place. And millions of people have moved into the middle class, though there are millions who remain in poverty. He's tried to reform the farmers with the farmers' bill that he has put in place. There are many of his opponents who support some of the proposals that are in there, because one of the main ideas is to try and cut out these middlemen that dominate Indian society and basically pay the farmers less than they should be paid, but customers are having to pay a lot more to buy from them. He's tried to change that, but we've seen that in the north of India, particularly in the very powerful agricultural region of Punjab, farmers have been, they've been protesting for almost a year now during the COVID pandemic, and they do have a lot of support up and down the country. And I'll just give you an example. I mean, I'm a huge cricket fan. India playing New Zealand in the World Test Championship final in Southampton. And when I was there sitting in the crowd, just went for a day with my son to watch the game. Behind us, there were protests by some British Indians in support of the farmers in Punjab. They were standing up, supporting New Zealand, shouting some comments about the Indian Prime Minister that we won't repeat here. But I think it shows you the strength of feeling that exists there. And in a way, the difficulty you have in trying to reform the world's largest democracy. But I think now, as we're 6 years in, 2024, the next elections in India, for the first time, serious questions coming from the jobless in India. You go to any big city, India's churning out highly qualified people in many sectors, many of them struggling to find employment at the moment. So many of them are asking, we voted for a prime minister who was going to fulfill our aspirations. Maybe those aspirations are not being filled.
Just to sort of, give us a sort of checklist in terms of the farming reform, can you just say in a bit more detail what was required? I mean, I know you were talking about trying to cut out middlemen. You were obviously trying to reduce the number of people working on the land. Can you say something a bit more, some of the specifics about those reforms?
Yeah, I mean, the main reform is in India, you have this system. And this goes back to a much bigger problem that has been in place, where we've seen not just Mr. Modi's government, we've seen previous governments, the Congress government in particular, trying to bring in foreign supermarkets, because what India doesn't have is an effective storage system for the food it produces. At the time of independence, India didn't produce enough food for its population. That's not an issue anymore. And so one of the key areas here was to liberalize that market and remove what was known as the mandi system. The mandi system is one where farmers go to this government organized market where the government give them a guaranteed minimum price for the products. Now, a lot of people would say, well, that's a great idea because, the farmers are at least getting a guaranteed minimum price. The problem is that minimum price is often too low for the farmers. What Mr. Modi wanted to do was to liberalize that system, bring in basically the free market to decide what the best price should be for those products. He felt that would mean that we would see farmers getting more for their money and eventually mean that we would see larger farm holdings in India replacing some of the smaller ones. The smaller farmers would, in effect, sell their land to the bigger farmers who would then be able to operate a better agricultural system in India. The difficulty, of course, is what happens to those smaller farmers. Now, the government has promised to pump in billions and billions of rupees, crores of rupees, to try and develop the rural economy. But if you're a farmer who for centuries, and remember, you have to understand the psyche of Indians here, they don't feel that government is there to help them. They feel that government is there to hinder them. During COVID, there's been no furloughing of Indians by the government. They just can't afford to do it. If you talk to businessmen, they'll say, well, the government has said that they'll freeze interest payments on loans, but we still have to pay it back eventually. So a farmer looks at the reforms and thinks, yeah, maybe in the long run, this might be good for me, but in the short term, what's going to happen to me? And that's why we've seen opposition in some states.
Yeah, and there's been a rise in unemployment and a slow job creation anyway, so you can understand how it's...
I mean, look, I'll give you an example of the job creation situation in India. And this is to do, whenever we're having a conversation about India, just remember the scale of the population, how young this population is. We're talking, about a working population of maybe 700, 800, 900 million people. If you go to, I was in one of a university the last time I was in India and talking to a professor there, and he said for the cleaning job that they had at the university, they had at least 20 applicants from people with PhDs because there's just no work in India. People are desperate to find jobs. When the Indian government had the world's largest recruitment drive, when they were bringing in 10 or 12 million people to work in the railways. They had over 100 million people apply for jobs. I was outside one of the exam centers. I've never seen anything like it. There were thousands of people just sleeping on the floor. And I remember one of the most telling conversations I ever had in India. I asked a young guy there in Hindi and I said, what happens if you don't get a job here? And he looked me in the eye and he said, I'll become a rapist. And I looked at him and I thought, what an extraordinary thing. I said, how can you say something like that? He said, so you're not understanding what I'm trying to say to you. He said, if I don't get a job here, because where I have no chance of getting a job in the private sector, I come from a village. He said, I am capable of doing anything because I'm never going to get a job in my life. So he said, obviously, I'm not going to go and do that, but I would be capable of doing anything because it is so hard for me to get a job at the moment. A government job is the only thing that I could ever get. And if I don't get it, well, then who knows what I'll do in my life. And that is the situation that we have in the country.
Rahul, I think it's been really useful just to go through these all these different elements, because I think when we do see coverage of India, generally we don't delve much into the economy and also Modi's reform agenda. And it does seem to me, from everything you've been describing, there was an ambitious economic agenda, and the problems he's been trying to tackle are really, really deep rooted and very, very difficult. So it does show you somebody who's quite determined. But let's delve into the stuff which is possibly more well known about, and in a way, I would say, at some aspects, is deeply undemocratic, and that's his Hindu nationalist agenda. Let's take two things, for example. Let's talk about the citizenship laws and the National Register of Citizens. What were they designed to do? Just tell us a bit more about them.
Well, they were designed quite clearly. I mean, a lot of this stems from a part of the India that I know well, the northeast of India, where you had seen a lot of migration from across the border from Bangladesh. So the National Registration of Citizens was basically, there were complaints, and we've seen a lot of communal violence that has taken place, particularly around the state of Assam, which many people will know because it produces some of the best tea in the world, between Hindus and Muslims there, with Hindus saying we are being swamped with migrants who are coming in from Bangladesh. You know, a conversation that we've seen in many parts of the world. We've seen for the first time, the Northeast has always been a part of India which the BJP has been unable to make roads in. But they've won elections in Assam recently. There was also a very crucial election in West Bengal recently, which is the heart of the Indian left, the heart of communism in India. They had the longest elected communist government, democratically elected communist government in the world. Mr. Modi spent huge amounts of money. It was one of the criticisms of him in COVID. He campaigned there, mass rallies at a time when people were supposed to be socially distancing. He didn't win the elections there. And one of the reasons may be that what he has seemed to have done with the National Registration of Citizens and basically the bill that he brought in place, which basically said immigration into India from on basis of asylum from surrounding Muslim countries wouldn't be allowed. You could come in if you were from Sri Lanka. You could come in if you came in from another part of the world and maybe you were a Christian who was being persecuted. But he said, take Pakistan, where, of course, there are huge concerns. You know, if you're an Ahmadiyya Muslim, if you're a Shia Muslim, that you wouldn't be allowed into India, and the same in Bangladesh as well. So here was, a lot of people said, a policy that was clearly against the ideas of the founding fathers of India, who saw India as a secular country, didn't go down the model of what was then East and West Pakistan. And here, for the first time, we had a government that was making policies on the basis of religion.
I found this fascinating. I didn't realize this phrase was used, but it's the two-state solution, echoes of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with India as this right of, if you're a Hindu, you've got the right to reside.
Automatic right to come home, basically. Yeah.
So just like the Jewish state, India is the Hindu state, and deliberately not a homeland for Muslims, which is incredibly controversial.
It is controversial. It is very controversial. But one has to say, it is a policy. What we have seen, I think, over the lasting the lasting legacy of the Modi government, whether you like it or whether you don't like it, is not, I think, going to be an economic one. It is going to be the way that he has changed politics and has, for the first time, led hundreds of millions of Indians to question the visions of their founding fathers. I think now, when I have conversations with friends, with family, people I've known for 20, 30 years, people who espouse to the Gandhi theory of secularism, many of them have turned their backs on it now. And, to some extent, inspired by the Modi government to say, and I think there are some analysts who've always felt this was always going to come at some point in Indian history. When you had the British saying we were going to divide the subcontinent on the basis of religion, there was always going to be a moment in history where we would see a Hindu nationalist party arise who would say, fine, that was the legacy of which we were based on. Now it is time to stand up and say, we are not a secular country, but we are a Hindu country. And that is a policy that Mr. Modi seems to espouse. We know that the RSS, who are the real driving force behind the Indian government, espouse that as well. And it has been a policy that so far in certain situations electorally has worked very well for Mr. Modi. Very well indeed.
This has been a really, really good introduction to things, and I'm now going to start opening the questions up. There's lots more that we can talk about. We haven't even begun to talk about Kashmir. There are many sort of comparisons as India's ambition on a global stage. We haven't talked about sort of nuclear politics, the rivalry of Pakistan. So there are numerous other issues that we can explore here. But let's start taking some questions now. I've got one here from Paul Jackson coming up. We just need to get Paul up onto the screen. Isabel's just going to do that in just a second. But while I think Paul will be up in just a moment. I'll just give him a second to come up, and while we're waiting, let's recap on Kashmir, Rahul. Tell us what's been happening there since 2017, and we're not going to ask you for the whole history of Kashmir, but just what's happened since 2017.
I mean, basically what we've seen in Kashmir is we're seeing the separation of the state into different areas. So we saw it split up. It was composed of 3 different areas. Ladakh, you have Jammu, which is the majority Hindu area, and you had the main part of it, which is obviously the disputed state of Kashmir, which is Muslim majority, India's only Muslim majority state. What we saw in effect was the Indian government locking down its own citizens, cutting off communications, arresting the democratically elected leaders in the state, and basically putting it under government rule. They were saying this was to tackle the militancy problems, the infiltration that was coming from across the border. Kashmir has been a flashpoint, has seen a number of wars between India and Pakistan. It's still probably the most likely nuclear conflict could be started in South Asia because of the dispute. Just to remind people of what happened at independence, the Maharaja decided that he was a Hindu, his state was Muslim. He decided to sign and join India. Pakistan then invaded Kashmir. They took about 1/3 of it. The Indian Prime Minister Nehru, many had said, made a mistake and should have taken it back. But he went to the United Nations, and we've had this dispute ever since then. Pakistan says it's part of Pakistan. India says it's part of India. Most Kashmiris in India would say it's part of, they would like independence.
With removing that autonomous status in 2017 and really putting it under sort of a kind of martial law.
Yeah, that's what happened. It's now been opened up again. But there's many who say that decision has lost another generation of young Kashmiris who feel that they don't have the same rights as other Indians. He's also, just very quickly on Kashmir, there is this Article 370 which prohibits Indians from buying, non-Kashmiris from buying property there. That has been very controversial. Indians saying if it's part of Kashmir, if it's part of India, why can't we buy land there? That's another thing the government wants to remove, which is highly controversial.
Okay. Let's bring in those questions now. Let's start with Paul Jackson. Go ahead, Paul.
Good evening. Well, excellent. I've been following India for a long time on the basis that it's going to be a world power, you know. And
we've all been hoping.
Yeah, exactly. And it's been quite disappointing, really, over 20 years. And you know, I mean, you've got PhDs, can't get jobs, you know. So there's talent in India, it's just unbelievable. But I wanted to first ask you, very interesting presentation, but there's no mention of the caste system.
Oh, yeah.
And there's 500 million people who are ignored. Is that correct? I mean, are they a drain on the economy? I mean,
it's one of the most interesting. There's so many things you can miss about India. That is clearly a big miss. The role of caste in India is still huge. Of course, Gandhi, when he founded the country, said we need to get rid of the caste system, but it's impossible to get something that's been ingrained as part of society for so long. Is it there in urban India? Certainly not so much anymore. It doesn't seem to play a huge part in life there. Does it play a part in the life of rural India? Yes, it does. You still have people from lower caste who may be killed because they go to a well that is there for the higher caste. And whilst India tries to move forward in a legal sense to stop discrimination in the workplace on the basis of your caste, what we've seen, and this is one of the most important developments in India over the past 15 years, is the growth of caste politics. So if you look at India's two of India's most populous states, Bihar and Uttar Pradesh population of over 200 million people, two of the main political parties there are basically caste parties who appeal to the lower caste. And so we have this very complicated situation where people from the lower caste say, we don't have the opportunities that others have, and we need a freer system. But how do we get to that? There's reservations in government jobs that have been put in place. But a lot of people are saying that's not working at the moment because some people are getting jobs who are not up to the jobs. The higher castes are now complaining that they want reservation because they're being discriminated against. There doesn't seem to be a way yet that Indian society has been able to give opportunities for those from the lower castes. And, the Modi government is seen as a high caste party. They are seen as a party who favors the Brahmins, the higher caste amongst, rather than the lower caste. If you look at the voting figures, you'll find that lower castes are less likely to vote for Mr. Modi than the higher caste, many of whom are making up the middle class and the upper classes in India economically as well. So the caste system is a huge problem for India. It's a problem it's not been able to address. It's a problem that Mr. Modi himself, like every other Indian leader before, I think has looked at and thought it's too difficult to address. I mean, the only way you can address that problem is to have a good education system in India, a good healthcare system in India, where people are treated equally. In India, it is still a country where you need to know people to get things done. If we're talking about COVID at the moment, the people who are getting beds in hospitals in India, in Delhi and Mumbai at that period when there weren't enough, were basically people who had contacts.
This brings, of all the countries I've been to, possibly India's the one that I've been most disappointed in. We've traveled to Iran, China, Cuba, places in South America. We've done a whole gambit of places. And what really frustrated me, this is a huge democracy, but its ability of politicians to come up with policies and then to deliver them, seem to be pretty small. And in some ways, I'm very impressed by Modi's ambitions. But I, like Paul, my expectations of India are that this should be a huge economic superpower.
I think to defend India, it's still an incredibly young country. We're talking about a country that got its independence in the late 40s, a country that was not able to feed itself. It's a country that it's a country that's remained democratic, and it's a country that post-liberalization has made great progress. And it's a country that still has more poor than any other country on this planet. So I think sometimes the expectations of India are slightly clouded when people look across the border at China. Because China has been a huge economic success, but with a very different political system. And also, if you've ever been to India and you've been to China, they're two very different cultural experiences. Indian politicians reflect Indian societies in some ways, a society where people find it hard to take decisions. Have you ever found an Indian saying that this is great thing? Everyone will say, get into a cab in India and ask your taxi driver to take you to the moon. And the first thing he'll say is, yes, sir, because that is the sort of way people don't like to say no in India very much. But I think it's also a very chaotic society. Just look at the roads in India. If you've ever been, if you go to India, it's chaos around you, and that reflects the country.
Well, I mean, this I just find that's a sort of cliche. It's like sort of people in Yorkshire are gruff, and Scots are.
No, I think there is something in that. There is something in that. Also, India just has not had the ability to compete with China when it comes to being able to make low-cost products, basically, because the Chinese, in their autocratic way, have used all sorts of people to make their products, as we know very well. India has disappointed, but I think India is picking up on the world stage. And internationally, I think you've only got to look at the sort of clamor of world leaders now when it comes to try and enter into the Indian market to see that it's a country that is moving. It's not moving maybe as quickly as people thought, but when we're not here, I think it is moving towards becoming an important economic power, and may well make it.
There are clearly some states that are far more effectively run than others. In terms of governance. Let me bring in. I shouldn't hog all these questions here. Yes, Suji, go ahead, Sue.
Hi, thank you. First of all, that was a really wonderful presentation. As somebody who has spent probably more time in China, but has visited India a number of times, I was always hopeful because, the discourse in India was always so much more open than China. China, is successful because it's an autocracy, but Modi is increasingly more autocratic. And so I'm kind of curious what you think is the major challenge he faces now that might, unseat him from power. We look at Xi Jinping and we think, we've got him for life and we're kind of stuck. But, for all intents and purposes, India is still a democracy.
Yeah.
So, but what would get him voted out?
Well, he may not be voted out. It could well be that within his own party, because of his election results, particularly the recent state elections in West Bengal, a state of 100 million people, where he did so badly. We have crucial elections coming up next year, particularly in Uttar Pradesh, India's most populous state. I think if Narendra Modi was seen to have lost his ability to win elections within his own party for the first time, I think we would see questions being asked, and he's not the youngest man anymore, about whether it was time to move to another leader. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge that he faces in the short term. In the long term, will he be voted out? The biggest problem that we have in India at this moment is the lack of an effective opposition. The Congress party, which has dominated Indian politics post-independence, has been reliant on the Gandhi family. What Narendra Modi has been able to do, which has resonated with hundreds of millions of Indians, is say, look at me, I'm a chaiwala. I came from the streets of India. I am like you, and I have beaten the system in the same way that Donald Trump sort of gave that idea that your system didn't work. And I am now the prime minister of your country. For the first time, you have somebody like yourself running this country rather than a family, which was the Gandhi family, where at the moment, Sonia Gandhi is not Indian. She's born in Italy, even though she's. And so I think what we would need is for the emergence of a leader who could unite the opposition of India. And looking at the situation today, that is not happening. And so whilst post-COVID, there is no doubt, go on a WhatsApp group in India, where before, if you said something about Narendra Modi, you would have been thrown out of the WhatsApp group. Now people defending him are being thrown out of those WhatsApp groups. So there clearly is a movement against him. But whether at a national level, Indians will look at this and say, he's not done a good job over the last few years. And things will change post-COVID. So remember, in the electoral cycle, this happened at a time which may hurt him less than if it happened a year or two down the line. But Indians may look at this and say, as often happens, at the state level, we are not going to vote for his party. But at the national level, we don't see anybody yet on the horizon who has the ability to lead this country. And that is I think the reason why at the moment, I think the biggest challenge facing Mr. Modi may come from his own party if he loses the ability to win elections rather than at a national level, because until India can find somebody to challenge him politically in an almost presidential race, he could easily win the next election again.
But are you saying, quite apart from him, the BJP and the sort of Hindu nationalist agenda is the winning ticket?
It is the winning ticket. There's no doubt. It's always been the winning ticket. Modi and Amit Shah have been the dream team. They have won election at national and state levels after election. But this is a very ruthless party. And if they feel that that's not going to be continuing, it is possible. There are figures. You've got a very powerful politician in Nitin Gadkari, who's seen as a little bit more to the center. If they feel that the Indian public would like a slight pullback from Hindutva, maybe back towards more development, a rather less abrasive figure as prime minister, that could happen. But if you ask me here today, who's going to win India's next election? I would say Narendra Modi, probably. If you'd have asked me before COVID, I would have said Narendra Modi, definitely.
Yeah, okay. Great. Elaine Moore, let's change of tack here. Question from Elaine Moore, please. Go ahead, Elaine.
Thanks, Rahul. Let's depress ourselves even further and talk about the country in the middle between China and India. And just as an aside, I have traveled in both those countries, as others have, but I was never groped or lectured at in China. So that's a topic I'd like you to come on to, women and their role in political life. But my question is about relations between post-coup Myanmar and Modi, because while I was working in Myanmar, there was a very highly publicized visit by Aung San Suu Kyi to India and vice versa. Yeah. And much was being made of India's role as a buffer to Chinese pushing into Myanmar territory and stealing all its natural resources and so on. And of course, post-union, a large number of Indians went to Burma to run their civil service. So how is Modi and his government dealing with the fact that a completely undemocratic military coup has taken place?
Well, I think, unfortunately, as we're seeing many governments in Asia, they're not really dealing with it at all. If we look at India's voting on UN resolutions on Myanmar, the most recent one, they abstained from that. And I think India will look, unfortunately, to try and develop a relationship with the generals, as you said, to try and subjugate Chinese power. Unfortunately, if you look at India, I think the Modi government, when you're looking at in South Block, which is where the civil servants operate in Delhi, unfortunately, they look around India at the moment and they see growing Chinese influence, whether it's Nepal, whether it's Pakistan, whether it's Sri Lanka. They see few places where they are able to have influence themselves. So I think they will, while they feel there's still a chance, they will reach out to the generals in Myanmar, and you will continue not to see much criticism, I'm afraid, coming from the Indian side, probably until they feel it's a lost cause, and the generals may be in the pockets of the Chinese. Even then, they may try and continue with that policy. But India, unfortunately, when it comes to human rights, whether it's in Tibet, whether it's in Myanmar, is fairly silent.
And yet they continue to supply lots of peacekeeping troops for UN missions abroad.
They do. I just wanted to come back on the other point, because I think that was
Yes.
it was a really good the engagement of women in Indian politics. It's if you look at Mr. Modi, he would probably wish there were less women in Indian politics, because he just lost a pretty powerful one in the eastern part of India, Mamata Banerjee. India's had a history of female political leaders. I mean, Indira Gandhi, many would say, pre Mr. Modi, was the most popular prime minister the country has ever had. But in the same way that I suppose Margaret Thatcher didn't seem to encourage a generation of female politicians here, female politicians have not, I think many women would say, done enough to tackle or bring to light the issues that women face in India on a daily basis. So in spite of what happened in Delhi horrifically all those years ago, the mass protests that took place, you go anywhere in India, unfortunately. I mean, I was outside, my daughter was at school in Kolkata, and I remember once picking her up and, seeing another mother crying and chatting to her friend and saying, and basically saying, if I don't have a son as my next child, I'm going to be kicked out of the house. If I walk into a building with my wife in India where we have to sign in, it will always be, unfortunately, me who's asked to sign the form rather than my wife. And when it comes to safety of women in India, there's a hugely long way to go, unfortunately. And a lot of the progress, I think, that was made after what happened in Delhi has been lost in the last few years. I think if you honestly talk to many women about how safe they feel in India, in some of India's cities, there's huge geographical differences. The northeast is, yeah.
Then can you talk about what happened there in Delhi and the incident we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Delhi rape case was when the young girl basically was looking to go home, and she thought she was getting onto a bus, a private bus, but actually it was a bus that had been taken by some men who then sort of gang raped her and threw her onto the streets of Delhi. It was one of the most horrific rapes that we know about in India, with the savagery of it. There was a very slow response from the police, and I can say, unfortunately, that is often the case. There was a similar case in Kolkata of a woman I knew, came to know very well. She became known as the Park Street rape victim. And I remember sitting with her, and she said to me, what was even worse than the rape was the moment that she walked into the police station with her father, which was a very brave man in India. She was surprised that he even took her there. She thought, because of the way things are dealt with in India, he would say no. But she said when she walked in there, and just the look on the policeman's face when they asked her the questions, and the sort of questions that they asked her, she said, was almost as bad as the rape itself. And that, I think, what happened with the young girl in Delhi touched a chord with so many women in India and men, that we saw millions of people across the country taking to the streets.
Thanks so much for this, Rahul. We've just got time for a few more questions. So I've got Paul Davis in South Africa. Paul, go ahead with your question, please, Paul. You just need to open your microphone, which might be on the bottom left hand of your screen, Paul, or could be on the top right, depending what kind of pad you're computer you're on.
Hi, I think I pushed the button by mistake.
Yeah, go on.
Don't worry, we can hear you.
I pushed the button by mistake. I didn't have a question. I've been too fascinated with the presentation.
That's okay.
Do you have any questions at all, Paul? Paul is involved in healthcare in South Africa.
So similar challenges, I would imagine.
Yeah.
It looks like it's going to look like it was in India.
South Africa is going through a very, very tough time at the moment.
Third surge.
Yeah.
No, I've just been fascinated by listening to you, Rahul. It's been absolutely fascinating.
No, but I just, can I ask you a quick question? Because I think, you know, and I often, when I think of where India is going, I think South Africa is a country that obviously has had very different challenges because of the apartheid political system, but economically, in terms of disparities of wealth and challenges of healthcare, I see both countries, you know, facing similar problems in the years to come, but also, you know, countries that are important because they're important in the regions that they are.
It's a big question that you ask.
Maybe you can give India some answers. That's what I was saying.
No, I think that it suffers at the moment from a very young government, and essentially it's failed to be able to adjust itself to the demands of the country.
I think that you know, I think that might be quite a good summation of the Modi government at the moment, one that came in with great ambition, but has struggled, you know, to meet the needs of the country, as many Indian governments have, because trying to balance the needs of this disparate group ethnically, you know, religiously, linguistically, as we heard before, on the basis of caste, on the basis of economic lives, is virtually impossible.
Yeah, well, just to come back, let's come back to COVID. We're going to wrap up in just a second, but just to take COVID as an example of government competence. Yes, governments all around the world have been wrong-footed by COVID. Very few have been deemed to have done well. But just in terms of this is the third wave, it's a colossal death toll. Yes, there's a division between the federal level and the state level, with a lot of powers delegated to the state level. But the healthcare system is terrible. It's terrible. And can you just give us a bit more detail about what's happened in the third wave? Because we talked about the second wave, but we didn't get into the third wave so much.
I mean, what we've seen, obviously, is this huge spike in cases, and we've seen in urban centres the lack of oxygen, and annoyance about a government policy that was done before. India is the largest producers of vaccines in the world. The Serum Institute in Pune is the largest producer. It was always going to struggle to produce enough vaccines for such a huge scale of the population. But there was huge annoyance that India was seen to be, Mr. Modi was giving vaccines to neighboring countries at a time when he was unable to vaccinate people in his own country. I think at the moment, you know, when we're talking about this phase in India, what we don't know enough about, it's something that we're trying to piece together, is what is happening in rural India. Mm-hmm. What is the situation there at this moment in time, where we know there's hardly any testing that you can possibly do, where the ability to vaccinate has been much slower, and more importantly, where millions of migrant workers have been going from the cities back to their villages. You know, when you talk to doctors there, they will tell you of huge death tolls in rural India, but people not being, you know, when the death certificates are being given, COVID is not being written on those at this moment in time. So whilst the coverage on your news channels may be declining at the moment from those images of the crematoriums that we saw burning constantly in Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, Bangalore, other Indian cities, that does not mean that the situation in India has necessarily got better. It's just got better in a certain part of the country. So real fears of what's happening in rural India. And when you speak to doctors and healthcare leaders in India, you know, as we do from the BBC constantly, there is real concern that India is not going to be able to vaccinate quickly enough to prevent another wave of COVID. And the fear is, you know, when you speak to doctors in India about who they were treating in the most recent wave of COVID, it wasn't people in their 60s and 70s. It was people below the age of 50, a lot of people in their 40s as well. So I think the real challenge now is to get vaccinations up. They are getting up, but just the scale of what we're seeing in India means, you know, India's not on track to vaccinate the full population until some point next year. And that could mean that we could see another devastating impact of COVID in India.
Yeah, I think the length and lifespan of this pandemic has floored us all. Who would have thought we'd be here in a year and a bit later, still talking about it, with the possibility of another year to go.
Well, it's stored many, but it's also changing the political system. For the first time, we started this conversation with the Indian Prime Minister. Let's end it with him. I mean, it is because of his handling of it to some extent. For the first time, we're seeing a possibility of a challenge to him. The dominant figure of Indian politics for the last decade doesn't look so dominant anymore. A man who was constantly on television addressing the nation has disappeared. I mean, there was that bizarre situation where you had a political party in Delhi. It was a joke, but filing a case saying, where's the Indian Prime Minister gone? He's suddenly gone missing. We used to see him all the time. So COVID has had a devastating impact on India. Will it have a devastating impact on the Indian Prime Minister? We're about to find out, I think.
Rahul Tandon, thank you very much. It's been a really, really interesting hour, very useful indeed. I've learned a lot. Thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you. It's been great fun. Thank you to everybody who asked questions.